Over the past few years, the popularity of isekai has not only grown to be one of the most popular genres, but unfortunately also became one of the most repetitive and oversaturated of them all. They typically follow the same formula of having the main character be sent off to another world, happening via their death. Of course, there are a few exceptions, but this is the general formula. It then follows through with them typically becoming boringly overpowered with no actual personality for the audience to get behind, and the void is filled with them getting some sort of makeshift harem along the way. Occasionally some will come and throw in a spin, with shows like Konosuba, and the main one I'll be focusing on today, Overlord. Overlord starts itself along the same lines as other typical isekai shows out there, but with a few fairly defined differences. It follows your typical salaryman being sent off to another world inside of his fully leveled undead character he'd played in the recently shut down MMO Yggdrasil. Taken alongside him in the new world was the base and all the monster-related NPCs inside it that he and his friends had created during their time on the game, before the supposed final shutdown. These monster NPCs are part of the main/side characters for the show, going through and following them along each in their own objectives, with us not only being shown them, but also quite a few of the varied characters of the world outside of Nazarick as well. Honestly, it's all pretty engaging, even comparing it to the main cast, so you never really have to feel like it's a meaningless chore just meant to stretch it out. It actually feels like you're being given a better idea of how things work in the new world, and can take much more time in developing this kind of world building due to its setup from the beginning, which leads into my next point. This being that there's no specific character to focus on making super overpowered as soon as possible, so it had a lot more opportunity to focus on the world building in general, and take a good opportunity to do so. You find in a lot of other shows that run with this kind of plot that it usually follows the typical they spawn, they grind, they win mentality without really giving any depth or personality to any of the cast outside of the main protagonist, who is so obviously built to win it feels pretty pointless. Thankfully they make it pretty obvious that they all no-life the game and paid to win, so that carried over pretty significantly in not only providing more opportunity for character development, but also more thought into the systems that were implemented in the original game with things like magic and items. Moving across a little bit to give a bit of perspective on the main character ainz, going into this I genuinely thought it was just going to be put across as the stereotypical isekai protagonist, but it was a pleasant surprise to find out that wasn't the case. One of the various ways they chose to expand this character was setting up a roleplay aspect in quite a few different ways, one of them being that he never really built his character to be strong in the first place. He was focused on the whole roleplay aspect of it and wanted to have as many spells as possible instead of having a few overpowered ones. The second way they play off this whole roleplay aspect is through his outward personality and internal monologue to the rest of those around him. He constantly puts on airs about what he's actually thinking and trying to play off that he's not just randomly acting on a whim, when in actuality that's exactly what he's doing. It makes for some entertaining misunderstandings, which basically ends up with him and the surrounding NPCs well on their way to taking over the world without the main character actually having put much thought into it and basically being pulled along for the ride. Speaking of the NPCs, they were probably another one of the high points of the show for a variety of reasons. They all came across as pretty charismatic and unique in their own way, with some of my personal favourites being Narbril, Demiurge, and Sebas. It was a nice touch that all of them were created by the original members and each take on parts of their creators' personalities in a variety of ways, typically being either how they appear physically or how they interact with others around the tomb. They show off this playful dynamic in a compelling way through both Aura and Shalltear. Their creators were both brother and sister, so they fight in a typical way that siblings might have a go at each other, so this conflict coming up sometimes was a nice shift in pace to see another side of more seriously portrayed characters. One of my personal favourites was Demiurge. His unique quirk of always thinking that ainz was always planning something much larger was always an interesting dynamic which ends up leading into the main plot of the story, when he thinks he's planned out an elaborate scheme to take over the world when in reality he's just going around exploring and taking in the new environment. The whole aspect of ainz having to put on the whole persona of trying to take over the world as if it was his own plan all along creates quite an unusual character that follows his personality slowly becoming more in tune with his undead monster creation instead of the office worker that he started out as. Honestly, all of their chemistry is always interesting to watch and each character clearly has a defined personality that shines through the dialogue presented. It doesn't take long to show and was another big draw keeping me invested in the show. The roleplay aspect also plays into one of the author's main inspirations for this story, as it's been noted that he was a big Dungeons & Dragons fan, but originally started writing Overlord after his friends are too busy to play D&D with him, which is a little bit sad but shines through the story pretty fluently and comes up at various points throughout it. The story itself is honestly just a ton of fun, and if you have any particular interest in the isekai genre or you might be getting sick of its repetitive nature, I would definitely recommend giving it a try, as it's definitely not afraid of taking on a darker tone with some of its themes, which leads into my next point. Unlike most shows in the genre, this one knows when to take itself seriously and when not to. It's always pretty few and far between. When shows like danmachi and sao continuously play out one-sided fights, it feels forced and the payoff is usually necessarily too underwhelming for me to enjoy, so having something that's a little less tone deaf is always more enjoyable. It's good to note that while progressing through the series, the perspective of ainz slowly gets less and less screen time, to really expand on not only the other parts of the world, but the characters populating them as well. It feels a lot more interesting to watch and breathes variety into what you're watching, as obviously watching the same old pattern of overpowered would get jarring, so taking that opportunity to explore other races and classes of people piqued my interest very quickly. Off the top of my head, it goes through a decent few, including lizard people, assassins, and adventurers all coming together to wrap up in the final season, and each character introduced having some sort of unique role to play in progressing of the story. It was also cool to see that even though it was Dungeons & Dragons inspired, it also reminded me of typical MMOs with dungeons and raids in terms of combat and the mechanics mentioned with various strategies used, staying reminiscent of the ones that have popped up over the years. It was also unique to see someone taking on the role of effectively the dungeon master in the show, which had to be one of my favorite parts of the series. At this current time, I'd be really interested to see people's thoughts on it outside of when it came out, now that isekai has calmed down a bit, as well as the fact that it came out at the perfect time considering the height of isekai was happening at the time, and to take people out of the repetitive loop at the time might have had an impact on their actual thoughts, and just wanted something unique to pop up, which is fairly understandable all things considered. Another pleasant surprise to the show was the music and soundtrack behind it. Myth and Roid always do solid work, and what they've done with this is obviously no exception. Even just the backing track and music in general is always pretty neat, and always builds the atmosphere it was trying to set very effectively, which I appreciated from it as well. So far, this is probably one of the only light novels I've ever been tempted to pick up after watching an anime, to gain an insight to all the details that might have been glossed over for the sake of time in this show, and to my surprise there were quite a few, which leads into while I generally do recommend this show, I do obviously have a couple of grievances with it, which I'll go into a bit more detail now. On the note of missing details, there were quite a lot of scenes that carried over from the source material, and then there were a few added that just straight up didn't exist in the original material, which came as a bit of a surprise that it didn't really serve much of a purpose in doing so. The whole interaction between the Dragon Knight and the old lady, and then the Dragon Knight going to stop Shalltear after she was going on a rampage, was completely made up for the anime for seemingly no reason at all. Originally that scene never happened, and the old lady was just a part of the second party where she used a special item to basically reset her. This is better put across when ainz goes and explains the various intricacies of the items used and created from the original game, and it makes so much more sense from that point, where it's detailed that players themselves create items with various effects, and he lists off some of the most powerful ones that existed in that world, some of which he had possession of himself. The explanation on why the ring didn't work was also not included in that part, which was another thing that felt kind of slapped in after reading, and it just didn't make a whole lot of sense to just not include it. Both of those scenes I felt were fairly important, given the items are one of the more focus points for quite a lot of the combat that goes on. It doesn't necessarily just apply to combat, but various other items that we used also become plot points, so keeping in any extra info about it can only really benefit those watching to get a better idea of what's going on. While I still thoroughly enjoyed the vast majority of the visuals, the animation was unfortunately what brought this down, and only progressively got worse per season that came out. While there were a lot of really well done moments, it's obviously not enough to make you forget about the rest of what's going on, but I felt like I could personally go along with it to some extent. CGI inherently isn't an issue, as it's clear shows can really pull it off like AOT, Dorohedoro, and Beastars, but it's unfortunately a bit hit or miss depending on what show and what studio is animating it, and unfortunately this one was a bit of a miss with it. On some of the smaller scale fights, I feel like it's more passable, but on the larger scale ones where it's more copy and pasted with the composition and camera angles left feeling so random and janky, it really brought down what could have been really engaging scenes.
It's black!
Yes, chef.
Oh my god!
For what reason they decided to go with this route, I'm not too sure, but I hope they steer off it for the newly announced Season 4 and the movie, which were delayed for a bit, for reasons I think you can guess. In order, I think Season 3 was a bit of a letdown overall and harder to remember what happened, unlike Seasons 1 and 2, which left a much bigger impression, but it still doesn't leave me without hope for the 4th season and movie, which I'm still looking forward to. Hopefully my expectations aren't too misplaced. To be a little bit more specific into some of the other details that were missed, which could have been better used as a way to keep in mind what we were watching was not from the typical angle of the protagonist, but instead from the opposing end, one of which was Demiurge's task of creating scrolls given to him fairly early on in the show. He went about solving this task by taking humans and various other creatures, skinning them alive, and then healing them back over to repeat the process over and over, to solidify that they were clearly not humane in the slightest, and made the continuous message of death being a mercy have actual meaning behind it, instead of a more unfounded catchphrase thrown around whenever. Another one of the side details I thought was understandably left out, but helped provide an outline, was Solution's request to to wanting to have children that she could swallow alive and feed on inside her. This was obviously changed in the show, and she was turned down by ainz. However, she was clearly not alone with the whole Overlord fetish, but that one stood out for obvious reasons, but was certainly interesting, as at other points where they had been vocal about such interests around someone a bit more normal like Sebas, the contrast between what they were saying and his disgusted reaction, it helps a lot because the show downplays these details a lot and glosses over them quite a bit, which serves as a key reminder that these people are not good in the slightest, which is one aspect I feel that brought the show down a bit. I got inspired to make this video after being recommended some old clips and scenes from it, but to wrap this up, I'd actually be interested to see people's thoughts on it outside of that mindset now that isekai has calmed down a lot, as well because I'm obviously a little biased to it. But if you're interested in taking a look at the light novel but are too lazy to read it yourself, someone's done a full voiceover for free, which you can take a look. I'll leave a link in the description as well. But honestly, if anything I've shown you today has piqued your interest, I'd definitely recommend either reading or watching what the series has to offer. But apart from that, I hope you enjoyed, and I hope to see you in the next one.